The night above the testing ground is still, and only the wind scratches at the wire. On 29 August 1949, a white flash will tear across the Kazakh steppe, and the age of one nuclear voice will end. Minutes later, the dust will settle back onto the plain, while instruments spit numbers that will redraw maps. In Washington and Moscow, paper will suddenly sound like metal. What did the American atomic monopoly from 1945 to 1949 really mean, and why did it fracture so quickly? When the B-29 passed over Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, the United States gained more than a weapon. It gained a pressure that seeped into every negotiation and darkened every corridor of diplomacy. Nagasaki followed 2 days later, and the world learned that a single strike could erase a city in the time it takes a clock hand to move once. In the months after VJ Day, factories at Hanford and Oak Ridge hummed, while Los Alamos turned knowledge into repeatable process. How did Moscow read this new language of power and decide not to fear it, but to master it? The Soviet leadership heard the same tone and understood that a monopoly would dictate the grammar of the post-war world. In 1943, Igor Kurchatov received a mandate that placed physics beside steel and coal in the hierarchy of survival. The state built a spine of secrecy and priority around the task, with Lavrenti Beria stitching together mines, reactors, and laboratories into one nervous system. Open scientific papers, captured German findings, and fragments of clandestine reports shortened detours, but did not remove the need to solve every step at home. How do you turn theory into fire when winter bites and materials crack? The answer was process. Uranium had to be refined until impurities no longer whispered into the crystal lattice. Graphite had to be so clean that neutrons could pass through with confidence, and explosive lenses had to focus a shock wave like glass focuses light. Workshops in the new nuclear towns learned to measure with patience and to repeat with discipline, logging each trial in pencil and peeling tape from instrument faces to read the truth beneath. Outside the lab, snow squeaked under felt boots, while the steam of factories condensed into frost on windows. Inside, needles climbed across dials, as if time itself were being asked to move. What exactly happened at Semipalatinsk when the countdown reached zero on the 29th of August, 1949? Just after dawn, the horizon looked like a straight rule on the land. Cable lines ran from wooden towers to dugouts where teams checked one more connection and touched one more ground strap. The device sat under canvas on a low stand, while a guard with a wartime rifle watched the door and tried not to watch the clock. Then the flash came, too bright for film to hold without a halo, and an invisible hand pressed down on the earth before lifting it back in one breath. Why did that blast ring so harshly in Washington that strategy itself seemed to change color? Because the calculus that had leaned on time advantage suddenly had to add a second variable. No longer could the United States assume that distance and altitude alone would keep the sky one-sided. In 1950, the paper called NSC 68 asked for more than funds. It demanded a posture for a long contest in which credibility and capacity would weigh as much as quantity of bombs. What did the end of monopoly do to the map of fear and the architecture of reassurance? A monopoly allows one hand to choose the bell rope. A world with two hands means both listen for the slightest tug and both rehearse what the echo might mean. The Soviet Union fielded the Tu-4, a careful mirror of the B-29, to translate laboratory success into reach, while air defense grids thickened with radar masts, plotting boards, and training that assigned each patch of sky to a name and a number. Why did technology race from fission to fusion within a few years, and how did that transform doctrine? Because fission could be a door and fusion a hall. The United States crossed the threshold in 1952 with a thermonuclear design that expanded the scale of what a single device could express, and the Soviet Union answered in 1953 with its own. Thermonuclear weapons did more than magnify yield. They offered tunable steps and families of designs that let states speak with posture rather than only with threats, using deployments, readiness levels, and test series as phrases in a new vocabulary. How did this new grammar reshape alliances and economies on both sides of the continent? In 1949, NATO placed ink beneath pledges and gave the American promise not just sentiment, but structure. The Soviet test changed that treaty from an option into a necessity because the danger was no longer theoretical. Industrial schedules tightened as steel and aluminum, vacuum tubes and special chemicals braided into timelines, measured not in seasons, but in margins of safety. Factories became schools that taught repetition, and repetition became a civic habit that reached into housing, transport, and research. Why did uncertainty itself become the main raw material of deterrence? Because knowledge was always partial. Reconnaissance aircraft, listening posts, and later satellites collected signals, but ambiguity remained the pool in which planners had to swim. The United States sent U-2 aircraft above the weather and later SR-71 shapes into the edge of the blue. The Soviet Union built networks that mapped emissions and prepared decoys that would waste the other side's precious minutes. Why does this matter now, when new carriers shrink warning times and new code flows through the veins of command? Because the physics of fear still respects the tempo of data and the discipline of procedure. Contracts that verify and channels that calm do the quiet work that used to be done by distance and delay. The lesson of 1949 says that technology changes politics faster than legislatures can coin new words, and that institutions must practice the muscle memory of restraint before the moment demands it. How did the American home front absorb the shock once monopoly slipped away? The United States reorganized armament as a steady state rather than a surge. Factory shifts were scheduled for a marathon rather than a sprint, and research budgets turned from one-time grants into pipelines that trained students to become the next year's staff. The national laboratories widened their charter, and universities linked fundamental work to applications that could cross the nation by rail and arrive on a test stand within a few years. Some of the fruits looked civilian, yet all were sewn along the seam, first stitched by the need to tame uncertainty. What did the Soviet self-image become in the glow and shadow of the first success? A story of vulnerability gave way to a story of capability. Scientific excellence and state direction were treated as twins and measured not by elegance, but by reliability when the thermometer fell and the power plant coughed. That culture designed for robustness and redundancy. It planned buffers in time and metal so that failures would end in repairs rather than ruins, yet it also paid the price of secrecy that narrowed debate and blunted some risks before they could be named. Why did the airfield and the plotting room tell only the first half of the new era while the launch pad told the second? Because once rockets reached beyond the runway, the clock shortened and the sky became a set of lanes rather than a roof. In 1957, the R-7 climbed from a Soviet pad and a small sphere began to chirp above the world to say that orbits had entered the conversation. The United States answered with its own launchers and satellites, and suddenly the words altitude and window sat beside words like harbor and canal in the vocabulary of security. Balance became three-dimensional, and maintenance of that balance became a matter of seconds and orbital elements. Why is the memory of 1949 a discipline rather than a commemoration? Because a chain reaction is not only a model of physics, but a model of institutions, and institutions need practice. Crisis communication seems dull until the hour when silence burns more than speech, and procedures are the only bridges that hold. Low trust periods require precise playbooks that smother misunderstanding in minutes. The depth of that craft is the difference between a long night and a long war. What does the first Soviet flash teach about strength and the order that follows a shock? It teaches that advantage is never only technical, and that superiority without structure decays into illusion. It shows that the real work is the daily earning of equilibrium through verification, restraint, and the humble keeping of routines. It reminds us that leadership lies in the ability to shape from a jolt a framework that can absorb the next tremor. The map of 1949 is therefore not a relic, but a manual kept near the console where alarms glow. How should we imagine the scene again to understand the weight of numbers on paper, a low berm in the steppe, a canvas truck and a cable reel? A group of observers crouched behind Earth while one pair of binoculars finds the point on the horizon where the air seems thicker. A moment later, the cloud climbs like a pillar with torn edges while the ground lifts and settles and a telegraph pole sways once then draws itself up. In the bunker, a gloved hand advances a chart and the jagged pen line bites upward. Why did Korea in June 1950 become the place where conventional and nuclear breathed the same air? Because strategy needed a theater where limits could be tested without crossing the tallest line. Field commanders learned to fight inside the shadow, while capitals learned to signal with restraint. And both lessons ran through cables back to the factories and labs. The presence of nuclear arsenals above the horizon made every bridge and ridgeline part of a wider sentence. In that sentence, caution and nerve had to share the same clause. Why did the tools of spying and the tools of speaking grow together in the decade after the first test? Because data does not persuade on its own. It must be placed into channels that opponents can trust enough to lean on in a storm, which means that reconnaissance and diplomacy become two hands of the same body. Hotlines and back channels were built to move faster than rumor and to hold steady when radar screens filled with noise. The ability to pick up a receiver and cool a moment was a weapon of equal value to the bomber on a runway. Why did industry feel like a school and a ritual at the same time in both systems? Because repetition is a social habit as much as a shop floor habit. The worker learns to turn and measure while the clerk learns to code and file, and both together feed a chain that resists panic. Schedules tighten, procurement maps thicken, and mistakes become audits that teach rather than stains that paralyze. The culture that emerges is quiet, yet it is the true armor that the public never sees. Why should people in the present tense care about a morning in 1949 when code now moves at light speed because the loop between discovery and policy is shorter than ever while the consequences are taller than before? New carriers shave warning time, new sensors widen reach, and new software squeezes the lag between doubt and decision. In such a world, the old guardrails are not enough unless we keep painting them. The habits of verification and the humility of procedure are not antiques, but tools that keep eloquence from outrunning prudence. How does this story end when it was really a beginning? The shockwave at Semipalatinsk ran out into the grasses and went silent, yet its energy stayed stored in doctrines and devices and the way officials weigh words. Silence itself became a signal, and pause became a sentence. Today, the same question hangs over every system that promises to decide faster than humans can breathe. Is strength the art of striking first, or the maturity to speak first and to listen even faster? The first Soviet flash did not switch off a light. It switched on a second light, and suddenly the room grew deeper and the furniture had sharper edges. If no one tends these lights, the room becomes a hazard where speed masquerades as wisdom and friction starts fires in the wiring. The answer of 1949 is that security is not possession but work. On the edge of the Kazakh steppe, it was a bang, a cloud, and a measurement that climbed across a strip of paper. In the rooms of power, it became a grammar in which every clause must carry both caution and resolve. We live still inside that grammar even as the punctuation changes shape and the dictionaries thicken. When monopoly disappears and only balance remains, are we ready to earn it again each day and to keep the lights from blinding us before they guide us?